Hello folk, how you doing? Scotty. So I was requested to do a video response on non-compete. He's done a video on the top 10 capitalist killers. I feel it's important for me to make the distinction of what capitalism is. And then of course you can then look at each example, and there's a wee bit more I'll add in. Capitalism is the separation of the economy from government. Now, ideologies and systems can only fall under one of two things. It's either collectivist or it is individualist. The reason why it's important to make this distinction, throughout his examples, he's basically referencing what is collectivism, what's anti-individualist. Capitalism is an individualist system. Now, I could not reiterate this point enough as it is. The reason being is because you cannot pull capitalism outside of individualism, and I've seen people try this numerous times and it's just so irrational. You can't do it. If you were to remove capitalism from individualism and correlate it to collectivism, well, what's the problem? Well, look at collectivism. The socialist principle of control by the people collectively or the state of all means of production or economic activity. The socialist principle of control by the state of all means of productive or economic activity. A collectivist, a person who belongs to the political left. Collectivist, subscribing to the socialistic doctrine of ownership by the people collectively. I understand that you get all these theories and everything like that. What you've seen of collectivism throughout recorded history. When you speak about collectivism, you're speaking about the primary element of the economy being the state, what it is in practice. And of course you could go on about the whole thing of the definition of socialism from the theoretical perspective, where they speak about in the hands of the workers, etc. Yeah, which never basically existed. Even their Paris Commune ended in terror, their anarchist Catalonia ended in terror, their Ukraine Free Territory ended in terror. I mean, there never really was what they speak about, this so-called libertarian socialism. Again, that's going off on a whole other tangent. In the real world of what you have seen in practice of basically socialism, you've always seen the state ownership of the means of production, and when you speak about collectivism in the real world, it's always been a case that the primary element has been the state, and the purpose of the people collectively is to serve the state, and that's what you've seen in every single socialist regime that you've possibly seen in recorded history. You saw that in Venezuela, you saw that in China's, under Mao Zedong, you've seen that in, the Soviet Union, you've seen that so many places like North Korea. Of course, you make that distinction between the theory and practice, because you cannot place theory above practice. This is why you cannot correlate capitalism to collectivism. And again, it's sad that I have to actually point this out. You can see here, capitalism is antinomous to collectivism. Right? Antinomous means that it's a word that's opposite in meaning. Capitalism is opposite in meaning to collectivism. Capitalism is an individualist system. Now, when you look at the definition of individualism, it is very clear of what it means. This is a social theory favouring the freedom of action for individuals over collective or state control, right? So in other words, it's basically defining the free market. Individualism basically describes and defines that of a system where the primary element of the economy is the individual, free to pursue their own economic goals and paths, in the absence of government intervention. I've seen some examples before, and Vicky 1999 tries to patronise the very fact that I used, the thesaurus, or that of course the dictionary. Each word has meaning. If a dictionary was not important, words in the English language would have no meaning, and you have to have some basis in understanding, so that's why it is important to look at the dictionary. Of course, there is far more to it than just looking at the dictionary definitions. With capitalism in recorded history, the economy has proven successful when it's been left free, and when you contrast that to when the economy has been under socialism, it's been an absolute disaster and turned out the exact opposite of what they proposed it to be. So it's all well having good intentions, but there are consequences for your actions. Moving on, let's just start off by his first example. Have a listen to this.
Number 1, Chiang Kai-Shek. Chiang Kai-Shek ruled the Kuomintang party that battled communists during the Chinese Civil War. When he ruled China before and during World War II, his decisions led to the deaths of millions of Chinese citizens through negligent and irresponsible governing, political repression, grain confiscation, and horrific conscription campaigns.
So you can see obviously from his explanation on Chiang Kai-Shek, he says about grain confiscation. What the hell has government got to do with that of capitalism and capitalists? Capitalists are business owners, or of course they could be workers who contribute in the production cycle. We'll go through some of the information here on Chiang Kai-Shek, and this will help further explain the distinction, because he's got nothing to do with capitalism. Born on October 31, 1887, and died in April 5, 1975. He attended the Boarding Military Academy in northern China in 1906 and in Japan between 1907 to 1911. He served in the Japanese army between 1909 and 1911. He met compatriots in Tokyo who would influence him on a plot to rid China of the Qing dynasty. He was converted to republicanism and made a revolutionary. Hearing of revolutionary outbreaks in China in 1911, he returned home to help overthrow the Qing dynasty. He contributed in China's Republican and other revolutionaries between 1913 to 16 against the new president Yuan Shikai. I think that's how you pronounce his name. He left out of public sight for a short spell between 1916 and 17, entering a secret society in Shanghai, and returned to public life in 1918, joining the Sun Yat-sen, leader of the Nationalist Party. The Nationalist Party, also known as the Kuomintang National People's Party, governed all or part of mainland China between 1928 to 1949, and ruled Taiwan under Chiang Kai-Shek. The Nationalist Party was established in 1912, participated in the first parliament, dissolved in 1913 by a coup d'etat, and the defeat resulted in Sun Yat-sen to organise it as a secret society. Chiang Kai-shek visited the Soviet Union in 1923 to study Soviet institutions, such as the Red Army. Back in China, after 4 months, he became commandant of a military academy established on the Soviet model at Whampoa near Guangzhou. Soviet advisors poured into Guangzhou, and at the time the Chinese communists were admitted into the Nationalist Party. Here's the important point. It says between 1923 to 24 it was led under the guidance by the Soviet Union by the Bolshevik Party. Right, so obviously they had an influence behind it. And then it says Sun Yat-sen died in 1925, which led to Chiang Kai-shek gradually becoming leader of the Nationalist Party, where between 1926 to 28 he would end or limit regional warlord autonomy, bringing most of China under control. Moscow supported Chiang Kai-shek until 1927 under Kai-shek led a bloody coup of his own, expelling the communists from the Nationalist Party and suppressing the labour unions they had organised. So again, it's really just this whole story where what happens is that, the socialist and the socialist movement ends up taking on these, communists, and then expels them, no different to what you saw in Nazi Germany. And it was the same thing in the Soviet Union, where socialists opposed other socialists, and how the hell do they think, Joseph Stalin came to power? He was competing against other socialists. It's a bit like saying, oh well, the Bolsheviks weren't socialists. Of course they were socialists. It's the same thing. As it goes on to say, under Chiang Kai-shek's rule, it became conservative and dictatorial. Later, China would break into a civil war between the nationalists and the communists. Although he was part of the Nationalist Party and he was this dictator, he'd carry out the brutal tortures and, of course, the killings and whatnot. He somehow thinks that's got something to do with a free market. What the hell's that got to do with capitalism, the separation of the economy from government? How he got to power was he basically led a war against that of the merchant class. The merchant class were the people who basically supported, more to do with capitalism. I mean, just because the fact that, he took communists and he expelled them from the party and suppressed, labour unions doesn't mean anything. It's no different to, Adolf Hitler. He basically, stripped the, trade unions or labour unions, whatever you want to call them. Although what he did in 1933 was he established his own trade unions, basically known as the German Labour Front, because he basically abolished the Weimar Republic's trade unions and replaced them with his own. They think that, Adolf Hitler, put socialists into concentration camps to die, therefore he must have been an anti-socialist. Just because of the fact that, he expelled communists from the party, all of a sudden he's this anti-socialist. Well, he's not anti-socialist, he was a collectivist. It was state-controlled. He controlled that of the economy. Non-compete admits in his own argument there that he basically, carried out grain confiscation. What's that got to do with capitalism? Capitalism's not about the actions of government. It's quite sad that I have to actually point that out. That's why I made that distinction and explained that capitalism to do with individualism, to do with individuals being free and economically independent from government intervention. So then you can see why Chiang Kai-Shek was nothing at all capitalist. Now we'll move on to his next argument.
Number 2. The Pinkertons. The Pinkerton Detective Agency was founded in 1850 and rose to prominence working as a private military contractor for Union forces during the American Civil War. During the labor strikes of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, capitalists hired the Pinkerton Agency to infiltrate, suppress, and murder organized American workers. The Pinkertons were notorious for fielding undercover agents skilled at destroying unions from within.
Again, let's look at the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, an independent police force founded in 1850 by Alan Pinkerton. So he was right about that, of course. Originally specialised in railway theft cases, solved the $700,000 Adams Express Company theft in 1866 and destroyed an assassination plot against Abraham Lincoln. The Pinkertons were involved in the Homestead Strike, which was a riot between the Carnegie Steel Company and many of the company's workers on July 6, 1892 in Homestead, Pennsylvania. The strikers of the iron and steel workers against the Carnegie Steel Company were violently attempting to deny the rights of non-strikers. Now, isn't it funny he doesn't tell you that? Isn't it funny he doesn't even mention anything about that? Of course he doesn't. Because he's a socialist. He doesn't see how the strikers were violently attempting non-strikers from being able to work. Of course, he doesn't see that as violence. Basically, he sees a one-sided story. As it says, Andrew Carnegie made preparations for the expected strike by hiring the Pinkerton National Detective Agency to protect his property, as there had been a previous violent strike in 1889. Manager Henry Frick had a 9-foot board fence with barbed wire constructed to protect the property, with 300 Pinkerton guards to protect the property and non-striking workers. Right, so basically rational, right? It's just basically a company that, okay, you could argue, oh well, exploitation, all the rest of this. Well, there was non-strikers. There's people who weren't striking. They have every right. They're contracted to the company. They have every right to, work. And basically to violently attempt them to prevent them from working, just because they didn't like what had occurred, basically to do with cutting wages. Then of course you had this violent strike, and what it's saying is of course that Andrew Carnegie, in preparation of all of this, had manager Frick build this fence or whatnot and hiring the Pinkertons. So this was all in advance. They were the ones protecting their property, and they have every right to do so. Doesn't matter what you think of it. They have every right to protect their property. Now, basically, here's what happened. The strikers on July 6, 1892, tore down the protected fence. On July 6, 1892, after the strike began, Frick tried to land the Pinkerton men at the fenced-in Carnegie Dock along the Monongahela, I can't even pronounce that river. The strikers tore down the fence, charged the dock, and fired on the towboat and barges that were carrying the Pinkertons. At least one Pinkerton guard was killed. The tug escaped, leaving 2 barges filled with Pinkertons behind. They fell under siege, complete with cannon and dynamite. There were additional deaths on both sides. At one point, there was an unsuccessful attempt to burn the barges to drown the occupants. In the end, the Pinkertons surrendered. They were savagely beaten and incarcerated in a local theatre. So, this is explaining. And finally, as pointed out, the Strikers Advisory Committee then proceeded to usurp all of the governmental functions in the town, like Robespierre's Committee of Public Safety in the French Revolution. The Homestead Advisory Committee policed all movement and activities of people in the town, especially members of the press. So basically, just to give you an explanation of what this is like Chaz. You know, they violently took over this area, they occupied this area, and basically infringed upon the rights of private property owners, and extorted, using theft and violence to extort from those private companies that were within that area. No, it's no different. They basically took over, the Carnegie Steel Company through force, through violence, and basically the occupying area of that town. It's no different to what they did in Chaz. It's no different to what you saw of the French Revolution. It's no different to, various other examples. Basically taking occupancy through the means of violence. Expropriating something from a private company owner through force. And then they act innocent. They act as if they are not, violent. So, then it says that the press was censored and several people were incarcerated simply because of what they had to say about the strike. The only thing missing was the guillotine, exactly, like you've seen throughout recorded history. On July 10, Governor Robert E. Patterson activated the National Guard and took the town back from the strikers, who offered no resistance. Peace was restored, replacement workers went to work, and eventually striking workers crossed the picket line. On November 20, the Union officially called off the strike. The strike was lost. What Non-Compete has painted as a one-sided story to make the Pinkertons, who actually defended the property, he's trying to make them out as if they're the culprits, these evil people, and that, it was just one-sided and they killed people and that was it. But they weren't innocent of what he's trying to claim. Let's move on to his next story.
Number 3, the military dictatorship of Brazil. From 1964 to 1985, a brutal anti-communist military dictatorship ruled over Brazil, stifling freedom of speech and violently oppressing the population, including disappearances and unjust executions of hundreds of Brazilians. During the military dictatorship, the CIA invited 300 Brazilian military members to the School of the Americas in Panama, where they had theoretical and practical lessons on torture, which would later be replicated in Brazil.
So again, I don't know how he draws to this conclusion of how you can claim a military dictatorship that is government basically controlling the economy. What that has to do with capitalism. The separation of the economy from government, the free market. The military dictatorship began in 1964 and ended in 1985. Castelo Branco would become the president of Brazil in 1964. The military regarded Castelo Branco's term as president as transitional period which would make drastic political and economic reforms. It's important to note that. So in other words, the military were in full support of Castelo Branco and his economic and political reforms. In other words, they agreed with his economic reforms. Right, they agreed with it. Get this. They would agree with Castelo Branco on his economic and social goals, but disagreed on how they set about achieving those goals. Castelo Branco limited and regulated sources of credit. In other words, socialism. And what's that got to do with a free market? How is it capitalist for a government to limit and restrict and regulate the sources of credit, in other words, loans, etc. For a government to limit and restrict and regulate such a thing, that's socialism. If you look at things in a question of scale, capitalism is about the free market that regulates these things itself, freely in the marketplace. Capitalism would be, for example, prices being let free in the marketplace, and government's controls being socialism. And then it says, restructured the tax system and collection procedures, and imposed wage and salary controls. Again, socialism. Capitalism is not about some government laying down wage and salary controls. The market regulating itself. That's capitalism. And it says the government also heavily invested in hydroelectric power and the transportation infrastructure. Again, what does government investment mean? Well, it's not capitalism, because capitalism again is about the investment of the marketplace. It's about private investors. What the hell has government investment got to do with capitalism? Nothing. It's nothing to do with the free market. Government investment is basically stepping in to prevent capitalism from being. It's no different to that of government lending. What is capitalism? Capitalism is about private lending. Government's got nothing to do with the capitalist system. No correlation whatsoever. The only job and role of a government in a capitalist system is to serve and protect individuals' private property rights. It's not to control the economy. It's not to control prices. It's not to control wages and salaries. So again, Brazil, like I said, the military dictatorship, nothing at all capitalist whatsoever.
Number 4. Augusto Pinochet. In 1970, Democratic Socialist Salvador Allende became president of Chile. It was the first time a Marxist had been peacefully elected to lead a liberal democracy. In response, the CIA quickly moved to overthrow Allende via a military general named Augusto Pinochet. Pinochet had been appointed as commander-in-chief of Chile's armed forces by Allende himself, but with material support from the United States government, he overthrew Allende in a military coup on September 11, 1973. The new government rounded up thousands of people and held them in the National Stadium, where many were killed. This was followed by a brutal Pinochet dictatorship that lasted until 1990. At least 3,000 people were killed by Pinochet's regime, and more than 1,000 are still missing.
So the problem with his argument is that when Augusto Pinochet took power over Chile, yes, he wrongly killed 3,000 people. There's no question of that, and of course he would carry out the tortures. The free market was not in place at that time. In other words, what I'm saying to you is, government's actions has got nothing to do with the market. How is the market, how is capitalism, in other words, that's what capitalism is. Capitalism is the free market. How can the free market be held responsible for the actions of what a person does when the free market wasn't even present at the time? It's arguable whether it was free market or not, but freeing up the market, shall I say, you wouldn't see that until about 1984 onwards. In the 1970s even. The reason he's very unique in this regard is because he was given advice from the Chicago school by the likes of Milton Friedman, and given advice on the economic reforms that he should take. And of course that transformed Chile, and Chile became the fastest growing economy in South America. To say that he was a capitalist simply based off the fact that he was killing people, okay, that's got nothing to do with capitalism. Capitalists are to do with business owners, to do with private individual ownership. not to do with what government does, and not to do with what some dictator does. And nobody who supports a free market would ever agree with someone killing, people. Simply because he was a dictator, he was authoritarian, and he killed people, then of course he was a capitalist. So, and you would very rarely ever come across a figure like that in history. Commonly what you'll find with dictators is they will lead and control the economy, and you'll go through the use of socialism. What does a capitalist system mean? It's taking power away from government. It's opening up the free market, leaving the free market be. A dictator would have to open up the free market and become less and less and less authoritarian in order for there to be a capitalist system. So that covers that. Now, have a listen to what he says on Park Chung-hee.
Number 5, Park Chung-hee. General Park Chung-hee rose to power during the instability of post-war South Korea. In 1961, he led a coup and quickly set up the Korean Central Intelligence Agency to arrest and detain anyone suspected of opposing his regime. Park's regime harshly opposed any form of dissent, imprisoning countless peaceful protesters and dissenters. It was a crime to even mention violent acts of the South Korean anti-communist government, including the horrific Jeju massacre of 1949. Martial law was declared by Park 4 times, leading to strict curfews and other harsh restrictions on civil liberties.
So essentially, Park Chung-hee became the president in South Korea in 1963 and was president until his death, his assassination in 1979. Now, this was another example. Again, he was unique. He would free up the economy to some degree. Of course, it wasn't as much as what you would see in Chile, but he would free up the economy to some degree. He was a very unique figure in that regard. Again, if you're going to free up the economy, you're taking less and less power. Although he did carry out much political repression, which, like I've explained, and the reason why I said I would be very brief at the start, is because some of these examples are just so ridiculous, and this just happens to be one of them. The market wasn't completely free. There would be government intervention. There was the issue with Park Chung-hee, where he would, limit that of the media, etc. Again, what's that got to do with capitalism? It's not about a government taking control over everything and controlling what, people see or hear, etc., etc. Now, his next example is on Suharto.
Number 6, Suharto. Suharto was a murderous anti-communist dictator who looted and terrorized Indonesia from 1967 until 1998. He's listed as the worst kleptocrat in history, having stolen between $15 and $35 billion from the people of Indonesia during his reign. He's even listed by the CIA as one of the worst mass murderers of the 20th century, which is ironic since recently declassified documents prove that the CIA backed Suharto's rise to power and his deadly anti-communist purges.
So again, let's cover some on Suharto. Suharto became the president of Indonesia in 1968. Restricted civil liberties, controlled key sectors of the economy, creating monopolies. In other words, it was basically corporatism, not capitalism. It's a mixed economy. Individualism, in other words, capitalism, is about protecting individuals' private property rights. And you have your civil liberties. You have natural rights. And the only power government has is to serve and protect your rights. It doesn't have the right to take them away from you. If a government takes your rights away from you, yes, it's socialism. The problem you've got is that a lot of people conflate capitalism. They either try to say that capitalism is the early stages of corporatism, or they try to say that capitalism is the same thing. No, it's not. Corporatism is the economic element of fascism. Fascism is a collectivist system. In the mixed economy, the best way to explain it is basically socialism strangles capitalism half to death through all the strong government regulation, etc. Here's the important point about Suharto. 2 oil booms in the 1970s, cutting exports, leading to a sharp, substantial increase in government revenues, which enabled the public sector to play a larger role in the economy. We're basically speaking about this of a mixed economy, and the public sector would play a larger role in the economy. Now, of course, it does mention about a period where there would be, deregulation, etc. in the 1980s, and certain reforms because of certain problems that were occurring. As it says, large government investments took place in the regional development, social development, infrastructure, and large-scale industries. Now again, what's that got to do with capitalism? As a result of the Malari affair, which of course broke out, there was an indigenous population that broke out because they felt that they were being neglected. That's what the Malari affair was all about. It was a violent reaction. So the government then laid on more restrictive measures on foreign investment. Again, socialism. Again, this has nothing to do with capitalism. For government to lay down restrictive measures on foreign investment and laid on preferential policies favouring indigenous businessmen. Do you know what that basically means, folk? This is no different to laying down protectionist tariffs and basically creating a monopoly for the domestic consumer. In other words, socialism. Using socialism in this mixed economy to basically restrict foreign investment by laying down protectionism, in other words, through socialism, government controls, to then, favour indigenous businessmen. Basically favouring the domestic economy, protecting the market from foreign investment, protecting the market from basically free trade, giving them more or less a monopoly of the market. It's really this thing where people don't understand the difference between that of capitalism, where you leave the free market be and you have free trade, to that of socialism with the protectionist tariffs, etc. And that's basically what that is. So let's have a listen to his next argument.
Number 7. The Saudi royal family. Saudi Arabia is a capitalist country that's ruled by a brutal monarchy with a long track record of human rights violations. The Saudi royal family's regime frequently rounds up and arrests political dissenters and subjects them to severe beatings, lashings, and even tortures them to death, even though they've committed no crimes. The United States government has backed the Saudi royal family since the First Gulf War. Saudi Arabia currently buys more weapons from the United States than any other country. The Saudi royal family is the richest family in the entire world, and Saudi Arabia is one of the richest nations on earth. Despite this, Saudi Arabia's capitalist economy exhibits extreme wealth inequality. Most Saudis lack adequate housing, healthcare, sanitation, and education, and at least 20% of the population lives in poverty.
As I said, folk, some of the examples that he gives is really outrageous, to say the least. And what's that got to do with a capitalist system of a free market? And then if we look at the Freedom Index and look at Saudi Arabia, it's anything but a free market. It's so far removed from it, it's unbelievable. The only reason why Saudi Arabia seems to be doing reasonably well for itself is because of the oil that it's so heavily dependent upon. It has a 66.6% rating of business freedom that's going down. It's going in the opposite direction. Well, what's that got to do with capitalism and a free market? Look at its labour freedom. It's sitting at 63.3. It's stagnant. Okay, its monetary freedom's been going up. That's reasonable. 81.0%. That's fair enough. And then, of course, you see an increase in government spending. Of course, government taking control. It's a command economy. This is what the Saudi Arabian economy is. And then, of course, we see the trade freedom. It's going down and it's at 75.4. Again, capitalism's about free trade. Then you see the stagnant investment freedom at 45.0 and finance freedom at 50.0. To back this, even from what is mentioned on the Index Monday, Saudi Arabia has an oil-based economy with strong government controls. Again, what's that got to do with capitalism? Over major economic activities. In other words, government's playing a large part in controlling the economy. And there again is a prime example of what I mean. I don't need to go into it too much. It's one of the most stupid arguments that he's come up with and tried to call this capitalist. You can't remove capitalism from individualism. I'm sorry, you can't. What is free market about a dictatorship? About a government strongly controlling the economy? Now we'll go on to his next silly argument. This next one really is.
Number 8. Mauthausen labor camp in Nazi Germany. Like many Nazi concentration camps, Mauthausen was a for-profit enterprise. Over 45 companies participated in administering the slave labor of the camp and profited greatly, including corporations that still exist today, such as Bayer Pharmaceuticals.
So how he can correlate something to do with Nazi Germany, a socialist regime that had strong political centralisation, and strong economic central planning, basically where the government controlled the entire private sector, strongly regulated the private sector, where the Nazi Germany government was dictatorial, controlled the entire regime, a regime that nationalised education, healthcare, the automobile industry, churches, the banks, and so much more, with, of course, centralising radio and newspaper so that they would control what people would read and see, as well as, of course, what they would listen to. You know, this was a heavily socialist regime, and he's now trying to say that something to do with concentration camps has got something to do with capitalism, which is to do with the free market. And this is the thing, in a capitalist system, if someone does wrong, they would go into prison. That's reasonable. He's basically trying to pass off something to do with a concentration camp, to do with that of capitalism, turning people into slaves, innocent people who did nothing wrong, put into concentration camps, use strong government regulation to completely control the private sector, gave the government collective control over the means of production, which defines socialism. That is another example. Now, let's just listen to his next argument.
Number 9, the Dow Chemical Company. In the 1930s, Dow introduced a line of wood preservatives called biocides. Workers exposed to the chemicals came down with severe illnesses, including one particularly bad instance of about 300 or 400 Mississippi lumber workers being harmed by the chemicals in 1936. By the 1960s, Dow employees were well aware of the toxic and extremely dangerous nature of the chemicals, which we now refer to as Agent Orange. In the early 1980s, the Dow Chemical Company maintained that both the Defense Department and the company were aware of evidence indicating that Agent Orange might cause birth defects in children of women exposed to the defoliant while it was being used heavily in the Vietnam War. Conservative estimates showed that around 3 million Vietnamese nationals have suffered from the effects of Agent Orange, and up to 2.4 million American veterans of the war may also have been exposed to harmful amounts of the substance. The United States Department of Defense sprayed at least 11 million gallons of Agent Orange on Vietnam, and it was all sold to them by Dow, Monsanto, DuPont, and various other major US chemical companies during the war.
So yes, in his argument, he makes a reasonable claim, obviously, about the Dow Chemical Company and, of course, a chemical that would cause serious harm to people's health and whatnot. But what he completely ignores is the very fact that he points out about the 1930s. I mean, the 20th century, the United States of America was far removed from capitalism. It was, long gone. People who would be working for the company wouldn't be aware of that. That's the fault of them. Now, in a free market, such a company would be punished for that. I would argue that perhaps this has been an accident. He's trying to make it out that, this is what happens when you leave capitalism be. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, but the more you moved into the 20th century, the more and more government regulations you would see in the private sector. But there was no free market there in order to punish them. So what seems to be the argument here? I really don't understand. Moving on, his last argument, he goes on to say,
Number 10, Winston Churchill. Today, he's mostly known for his witty quips and eponymous giant cigars, but Winston Churchill started out his career as an enthusiastic agent of British imperialism. He helped suppress freedom fighters in India, Sudan, and Cuba as a young military officer, seeking out combat against imperial dissenters as often as he could.
Yes, Winston Churchill spoke a good word of and about capitalism. But there's a big difference about speaking a word about capitalism and what you do in practice. And Britain was never really capitalist at all. I think the only time period you would say, you would argue was under William Gladstone, and that was very short-lived. Throughout the British 19th century economic history, it was strongly dominated by the likes of mercantilism, imperialism, and you would see the colonialism. Winston Churchill, he wasn't perfect. He led British imperialism. The likes of India gained independence in 1947. People tried to make up myths about the guy. They even tried to claim that he was responsible for the Bengali famine. He actually tried to help them. And I don't think anybody would ever support imperialism or colonialism, which are both inherently collectivist. He's now trying to correlate capitalism with imperialism. What the hell's a collectivist system got to do with that of individualism? He rightfully goes down in history as a very important figure, and there's probably a lot more to him, a lot more positive things about Winston Churchill that I'm probably completely unaware of. So anyway, folk, if you've got any questions that you would like to ask me, feel free to comment in the comment section below. I'm pretty sure you might have certain things to add in yourself. You might have some information or whatever. Feel free to comment, but like I said, that's why I pointed out the distinction of what capitalism is. You've immediately lost the argument as soon as you start correlating what government does and controls over the market to that of capitalism. Now, I'm not saying that in a capitalist systems in many, such as Hong Kong, etc., that there hasn't been government intervention and there's been economies with low levels of government regulation, but typically what defines a common capitalist economy is one that's strongly free from government. Anyway, folk, thank you for watching, and I shall talk to you later. Cheers.